Hi everyone. That countdown's really exciting. You're very welcome to this Hot Topic Symposium. My name is Sinead Harmey, and I'm here with colleagues from the IOE, Katya Saville, Sandra Leet McGray, Gemma Moss, and Alice Bradbury. And together for this symposium, we are considering evidence from 2 empirical studies and a systematic review looking at the kind of problems that have been created by COVID-19 in primary and secondary schools, and the kind of solutions that and priorities that might be required going forward. So just to say that in terms of papers, Gemma and Alice are going to present first. The title of their paper is Catch Up or Bounce Back, Assessing the Dimensions to the Challenges Facing Education Post-COVID. Paper 2 is Katya and Sandra, looking at cohort learning fragmentation and protective bubbles, the complex impact of COVID-19 on primary to secondary school transitions in England. And finally, paper 3 is me, and I'm going to be presenting findings from a systematic review, learning from learning disruptions, using evidence from the past and present to inform the future. Please feel free to use the question and answer function. We'll be keeping an eye on it during the presentations, which are 20 minutes each, leaving hopefully 20 minutes for questions at the end. And at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Alice and Gemma.
Thank you very much, Sinead. Alice is going to be the keeper of the slides and will take us through the presentation. I'm starting off and then Alice will come in later and then it will come back to me. So I have to say at the moment, oh, slides just coming. That's always a nervous moment. Okay, our paper is really based on 4 empirical studies. Alice, if you can shift on. And we're going to be focusing in this particular presentation, though, on 2 of the studies. Back up, what happened during summer 2020 and then summer 2021, teasing out implications for schools, for policy and for research. Next slide, Alice. Okay, I want to start with a provocative question. Who is in control of the policy discourse on COVID and education? And I've got an example of a headline from the TES yesterday in which the Ofsted chief says that some schools are paying too much attention to putting food parcels out and not enough attention on learning. This is a contentious claim. Okay, next slide. In fact, our very first COVID project was actually inspired by learning about Zane Powells, who has indeed walked he's delivered 7,500 school meals to his children from his primary school. What we felt was that in conditions of uncertainty, there simply is no available ready research or guidance. Those on the front line are discovering what the issues are fastest. Those standing further away often misread the context, and in conditions of uncertainty, we get a lot of blame running around the system. We wanted to know what schools themselves were doing. Next slide. And this is the range of projects and the range of people that have been involved, and we are drawing in this presentation from the 1st and the 4th project. Next slide. Okay, the first project was called A Duty of Care and a Duty to Teach. We wanted to know how schools were managing respond to welfare needs alongside managing learning. So we understood there was a tension, and there was a tension that policy was picking up on. You've got a description there of our method for the data I'm going to present as part of this project. We collected our data via teacher tap survey, and you'll have read that slide quicker than I can speak to it. We've got 1,653 responses from primary school teachers, and we can analyse them according to quartile of pupils eligible for free school meals. It's a reliable data set, which was very useful to be able to draw on in the summer 2020. Next slide. Next slide, Alice. Okay, my slides are not going on. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know if Alice is frozen. The next slide I was going to show you was the survey data. Okay, we asked respondents about what their biggest priority was in communicating with families during lockdown. That's a simple breakdown of all of our respondents, and you will see that checking how families are coping in terms of mental health, welfare, food was the highest priority, with how parents can support children's learning coming in second. However, if we do a breakdown by quartile, next slide, please, Alice. Alice, next slide. Okay, broken down by quartile, what we can see is that there's a real difference in terms of the amount of attention that looking after children's welfare is attracting, depending upon whether you're in a deprived community or not. Information on free school meal vouchers, for instance, is really sharp difference, and almost twice as many schools in deprived areas are making support for families experiencing hardship a priority. Next slide. Okay, if we do a similar breakdown on the question we asked about creating teaching resources during lockdown, identify your top 3 priorities. What we can also then see is that those schools in more affluent areas are making more use of the opportunities to do things differently. Now, that's both because of different conditions under which children are learning at home. If you're a family with no access to outside space, you're living in overcrowded conditions, you're sharing one mobile phone between 4 of you, the possibilities to do things differently are very different from if you're in a middle class family, loads of digital, loads of space. It's a very different prospect teaching at home. So in all of these different ways, our survey data flag up, next slide please, that poverty creates a burden. And what we wanted to know is, given the stresses appearing in the education system through having to react so swiftly to COVID, and for schools themselves to find out what they could and couldn't do in their context, how was this changing views about the future for education? So our last question in the survey, that you can see right at the bottom of the slide here, gave respondents a chance to give their priorities for the system going forward. The most popular statement was, if testing inspection goes ahead as normal next year, schools serving the most disadvantaged communities will be unfairly penalised. Right the way across our data set, everybody recognised that teaching children living in poverty creates particular stresses. And if we need to start again, we have to move away from a kind of testing and high stakes accountability system that pays no attention to those real differences. If we look at the next slide, we will see that part of our output was to tackle 3 big topics that we knew schools were worrying about, and in a way speak back both to schools and to politicians about what it was we thought needed to change in the wider system as a way of reinforcing and speaking to what teachers themselves were thinking and feeling. Alice, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. I think we're experiencing a bit of delay with the slides, but hopefully you can see them now. So I'm going to talk about this second project, which is the Learning Through Disruption project, which we did this year in this summer term, again funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And this had a different kind of design to it. We built a design based on the case of the school. We ended up with 7 case study schools. And in each school, we interviewed the head teacher, a number of staff, and a number of parents. We also made links with what we call a broker organisation. So each school had some kind of middle tier organisation, a multi-academy trust, a local authority, or a relationship with a teacher union. And we also interviewed 5 out of 7 cases. We had a broker to interview as well to try and understand the decision-making processes that were going on. So we had 50 people we ended up interviewing in total, spread amongst the heads, teachers and parents and brokers. And our sample was deliberately constructed on the idea of maximum variation. So we had, as you can see here, different types of school. We had different Ofsted grades, different kind of results, and different kind of levels of COVID prevalence in the area, though that was very difficult to kind of establish. We also had different regions of England. They are all schools in England. We haven't put them in to keep the schools more anonymous, but the regions represented are London, the southwest, the Midlands, the northwest, the northeast, and the east of England. So we had pretty good coverage geographically as well. We wanted variation also in terms of free school meals, as you can see here. So the national average is actually 23%. So we ended up with a number of schools who had higher than average free school meals. But we did end up with some with slightly lower percentages too. So across these schools, we found a number of key findings, and we're going to highlight just three main areas today. The first one is that schools' responses to the pandemic were very much rooted in their understanding of their local community's needs. So it's important to remember that actually there is huge variation in schools' experiences. They each have their own COVID story. And we found variation in the number of actual cases in the area, levels of disease, the different impacts on employment, different economic impacts in different cases. So in one school, for example, school 2, a major local employer was completely shut down, and they had a huge increase in the number of free school meal applications. As this head says, the jobs just imploded. In another case, in school 5, which was in a slightly more affluent area, a lot of families were still working in the NHS and frontline services. And so that caused a lot of disruption, uncertainty. People weren't able to use grandparents for childcare. And so it became quite an issue at their school. In another school, which had very high free school meals, actually the parental employment base stayed relatively stable. There was very low incidence of COVID itself. And so they actually had a pretty positive response to report and a positive experience. We found that the schools responded in multiple ways. So there were food banks, there were constant check-in with children's welfare, there was provision of clothing, toiletries. There was also help with problems with housing and citizenship, particularly people's right to remain after Brexit. So there was a huge variation in what schools were doing. And as this head says, we just had to go around the homes. We've been trying to get in contact with the families and they're not responding, and they need to have breakfast. And it was felt that this welfare role particularly was a very important part of schools' responses to the crisis, although it took different forms in different places. So the schools gained a huge amount of knowledge about their schools and about their communities, and they adapted what they did in response to that knowledge. So both in terms of their who were they allowing to come on site to attend school and the kind of remote learning that they were doing. So at school 5, the head talks about becoming much more aware of family poverty because they were signposting families to food banks, and the fact they had to take around packs of learning to certain families because they didn't have internet access. So she talks about the pandemic enabling them to know their community in different ways and in more meaningful and more accurate ways, which is a really illustrative quote. We also found that there was overall a kind of principle of welfare first to allow children to learn. And I think that's probably something that Amanda Spielman ought to be thinking about, that they were always recognising that the well-being of children came first. So the head at School 1 talks about, we're not saying we're going to focus on the well-being to the detriment of the academic. We're saying we're going to focus on the well-being to ensure that we can focus on the academic, and every school should be doing this. So that principle we saw, again and again, based on what the schools knew about their local community. And we found this huge amount of adaptation over time. Obviously, this was the second year of the pandemic. The heads talked about being responsive to the different changes, the different rules, and they felt that they actually became very good at knowing what to do and how to respond, given their knowledge. And so one of the ways we found some schools adapted was when the rules about key workers changed, they actually began to allow more and more children who they saw as vulnerable to come into school and actually be on site. So our second finding is that poverty has very diverse impacts, and that's something that needs to be considered when we're thinking about how to address the impact of poverty. Food was the major issue. All of the schools said their main priority was food, and they had various strategies, connections, charities, local businesses, that they used in order to resolve the problem of children just simply not having enough to eat. So it was very much about basic needs, as the head teacher says, and they also say, look, online learning was not a priority because the well-being of children, and particularly food, had to be the priority. Poverty had different kind of faces. We say there are different issues in different schools which are broadly related to issues to do with poverty and disadvantage. Problems with housing, particularly, and difficult landlords, problems with the communities in some schools who had no recourse to public funds, who were facing particular difficulties, and other cases like this one where there was an instance of domestic violence. The family got moved into temporary accommodation, which turned out to be infested with rats. And the school actually allowed the children and the mother to come and be in the school in the day so that they didn't have to be in this rat-infested accommodation. So the schools were being responsive to a number of different really challenging issues. Some of the families that were hardest hit were families that had previously not been on free school meals. They weren't in those kind of figures, but they had lost their jobs, or as this head teacher talks about, people who'd been furloughed, people who had always had a job. They start coming to the free school, to the food pantry. They're not the free school meal parents, but they're, it says, the tier above, a new group of parents who were experiencing poverty for the first, or food insecurity, I should say, for the first time. So our third kind of conclusion here is that actually it is better to talk to schools about what they need in terms of recovery. The kind of generic solutions actually don't work in many of these cases. So the head teachers told us about, the government says, oh, we'll just give out all these devices and it'll all solve the problem. But actually, it's more complicated than that. And they felt that systems like the National Tutoring Programme, which were kind of a kind of catch-all solution, a one-size-fits-all solution, weren't going to work because they needed their children to be taught by people that they knew. This head says, I need my children to be taught by people that they know because it's about relationship. And my understanding of the National Tutoring Programme is it's a tutor from anywhere and online. And the schools that did engage with the NTP actually were using people that they already knew, they already had a relationship with. So there's a feeling that schools are actually the ones who know best. There was also a general rejection of the idea of catching up. As this head says, it's not part of our catch up isn't just ensuring that children are retaining and learning. We're creating children who are going to grow into adults that can be resilient and deliver a successful life in the future. They've got this kind of longer term view of what matters. There were, of course, I should say, real gains from the pandemic, particularly in terms of communication with parents. And as this head says, we've really improved our communication with parents, and it's fantastic. They're at a really good stage, and their understanding and empathy for school staff has really improved. But there was an overall rejection of the idea that schools should be doing intensive work to catch up. So overall, we're saying that these adaptations that we see amongst the schools show how, as embedded kind of responsive organisations, they are actually the ones best placed to build the recovery plans. So back to Gemma.
Okay, we want to leave you with 3 priorities in the light of the title of this session, and also a question. In a way, we've been using our research to focus in on real feedback loops happening at school level, which means schools know profoundly more about the impacts of COVID than do policymakers and politicians standing at afar. They have different priorities. We're saying trust the teachers' priorities. We also think an absolute standout need is that schools working with the very poor must be funded more generously to meet children's basic welfare needs. There's complaint that pupil premium isn't impacting on attainment and it shouldn't be spent on basic welfare. If children are not well fed, how can you expect them to learn? Child poverty in the UK is a real issue. We need to do something about it. We also think that there should be more attention paid to what schools themselves have already been doing. We feel that we're only just starting as a research community to kind of document what they've been doing. Wouldn't it be great if there's more long-term research going on about how schools reacted and what it's led to? We also think we really need to reorganise how the education system is organised, so there are more opportunities for schools to share what they've learned locally. And all of this means that we think the catch-up frame is not right. It concentrates on immediate, it sets you a goal for meeting the next test's standards, whereas really what we need is investment for the long term. Our final question, though, to the audience is, what are researchers' responsibilities for system change? How can we best engage with politically charged questions? We think COVID is a politically charged issue. Thank you very much. And over to Katya, who is going to talk about fragmentation and protective bubbles.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Alice. And Sandy and I are going to be sharing about our research project on school transition. Sandy, you're going to be starting off.
Yeah, so have we got our slides?
Yes, can you see them?
Yes, I can see them now. We had a particular stimulus for our project. So Gemma mentioned talking about somebody delivering meals to 7,500 students. Our project really grew out of a concern for 11 to 12-year-olds. Two of us were parents of 11 to 12-year-olds, and suddenly gave us some very panicky thought to what was going to happen with regard to school transition. And it wasn't an area that we'd researched in before, and we suddenly realised this is a really overlooked topic generally. So we were funded by UCL and the Wellcome Trust to look at the experience of this through the pandemic, with a view to, first of all, seeing what you can do in times of crisis, and also what you can do in a longer term sense. So we learned some very interesting things. One of the things that I think all of the people working on COVID projects would be able to relate to is how quickly everything happened. So the funding happened extremely quickly. And then we had a sort of green light system in place for all COVID research, whether it was social science or medical or to do with vaccines or whatever. And it was extraordinary, really, because we're all used to a lot of paperwork and sort of bureaucracy when we're trying to do research projects. And suddenly we still had to do the same paperwork, but suddenly everything happened quickly and everybody always said yes to everything, and it was incredible. So, for example, ethical approval would happen practically overnight, with everybody bending over backwards to help us get everything in place. We were able to set up all our systems really quickly. We had a few problems with the first data collection phase, recruiting sufficient numbers of research participants because it was the summer holidays. But we still managed to get people in place and to find things out. We started using video conferencing for doing our interviews. Well, we hadn't really done much of that before. It was usually an add-on. Normally we would expect to be travelling to schools to talk to pupils and teachers, so we had to get to grips with that, but actually that was quite helpful, and we could do that in a much more slick way with automatic transcripts and all sorts of things. So a lot of learning on the job, but in the event we did about a year's worth of work in 6 weeks with the first phase. Exhausting but very stimulating. Next slide, please.
Yeah. And
so Kat, do you want to talk a bit about
Yeah, so it was an emergent design to some extent, which was a real advantage because none of us knew that there was going to be a second lockdown. We may have suspected, but as you can see, because of the recruitment issues, we decided to do an autumn data collection round, and then we very quickly went into a second lockdown. We decided actually it would be a really good idea to do a third and final data collection round, which we have just finished. And you can see that that was really fruitful in terms of the numbers, but also the perspectives that were gained from both students and from teachers. So we had 2 parts to our data collection: surveys using REDCap, and then interviews from there, although people could also just choose to opt straight for interview if that's what they preferred, and some did. And really, at the beginning, we were very much focused on transition, which can be conceptualized by some as an event, but the literature, Divya Jindal Snape writes a lot about this, and it's in the reference list, really tries to encourage an ongoing view of transition over a longer period of time. And to some extent, because we wanted to get findings out, we wanted to focus on the gaps in the transition preparation for those students, as well as the gaps in learning. But then obviously, as we got the follow-on funding and developed more, we were able to add new questions in and focus longer term on the issues such as mental health and the impact on learning. But the initial data did focus on the transition, which was moved online. And there were issues with that because a lot of those students from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly in primary schools where there wasn't a laptop scheme, weren't able to access that. But primary schools did do a big push, and those were in our data, to kind of get those students online in the summer term. So there were gaps. However, there were teachers who said that parents, like Gemma's and Alice's study, were more engaged because it was in line. So maybe they had younger siblings, it would have prevented them going to an evening event. They were able to engage online, and students really benefited from that, but there wasn't a lot of it last summer. There's more of it now. But really, we also were interested in the challenges presented by lockdown learning and the impact, and to kind of speak to this idea of now further on, what is the need for recovery. And the bar chart that we've got here shows two phases of our data. So where we asked people about the first lockdown and the second lockdown, first one being in blue, we can see that the percentage that had thought there was significant disruption to learning was much higher in the first lockdown than in the second lockdown. So these students in their year 7, and they spoke to this as well in the qualitative responses, that they felt much more comfortable, much more organised in the second lockdown. However, there were a chunk of children that did struggle with their organisational skills, and one teacher spoke very much about realising that there was a group of year 7 students that hadn't learnt to tell the time sufficiently, and the secondary school teachers hadn't realised, and they weren't coming to their classes because they were struggling to manage the timetabling, and then they managed to identify this and put an intervention in. But this also showed how constrained assessment was during that online learning period, but also we looked at back in school, and teachers spoke very much about how this kind of informal assessment for learning peering over students' books wasn't possible. And so there was definitely a feeling by some teachers that they hadn't got that same handle. They weren't able to assess so individually. They had the paper test, but also the SATs weren't there. And there were mixed feelings around that also from parents and students as well. And a lot of the kind of celebration, the end of year 6 wasn't there. And this comes through again and again in the data also that I present on mental health. Group work was something that was missed, but more importantly, when we look at the students going into year 7, their expectations of the curriculum, sometimes they didn't know what they weren't missing. So extracurricular activities are extremely rare and are linked to successful transition in work by Langenkamp in the Netherlands, not only in terms of mental health, but also achievement. And obviously, for obvious reasons, those just weren't there, but they very much, students were aware that they had been expecting a lot of practical activities, and science kept coming up as something that they were missing, and because of the restrictions imposed by COVID. But there were a number of things that we found out that obviously were gains in learning. The teachers felt that they had made a massive online leap almost in their learning. One of them said the data that we have on the self-scoring of their confidence before and after each lockdown is obviously hugely different, but also the increased learner autonomy. We talked about the challenges, but the skills that were developed, students spoke about how they were able to enjoy different parts of their learning, pursue different areas of interest, but also we had a parent of a special needs child who said that they would never normally have thought about letting their child walk to school, but because of needing to be at home with a younger sibling and the constraints of lockdown had actually let this child walk to school partly by themselves and organise their things for school. So there was an impact and increased learner autonomy in very different ways that happened because of this transition process happening during COVID. But obviously, like a lot of other research, and fits in with what Gemma and Alice have been saying, the priority in most schools that we interviewed was on wellbeing first. And very much this feeling that yes, services are overwhelmed, but what can we do about it? So individual teachers, form tutors, heads of year talking about developing triage systems so that they were picking up students, because they had all mentioned different experiences of students that didn't seem to fit the vulnerable category, but it would come out that they were extremely vulnerable because they felt that they had no friends and were really struggling with their mental health. Sometimes parents stepped in, and that also shows that parents stepped in with referring, and that really speaks to the idea in the transitions literature how important relationships are in this transition between year 6 and year 7, relationships with teachers, but also relationships with parents and their year 6 peers. And this was important in our data because when we spoke to year 7 students, and actually this came through more in the interviews, at the end of their year 7, it was clear that there were some students that hadn't been able to finish year 6 successfully, in the sense that they hadn't had that closure. And most of them, it was around not going back to school, or the fact that very few students went back to school. And so one student with some special needs talked about missing their year 6 friends, even almost a year later when we interviewed him, because they'd never exchanged phone numbers. And that really was felt during the second lockdown, when the protective kind of relationship with year 6 of other participants. We had one student talking very much about, I was at a different school from my best friend, but it was great texting her, and she was a real reassurance during that first term or two. This student didn't have that. And another student talked about how they didn't have the year 7 friendships established, and their parent kind of interrupted and explained that they had all met socially online through a WhatsApp group, and then there'd been some online bullying. The child withdrew, went in for a disrupted autumn term, didn't get the phone numbers before Christmas, and then spent the first term not really communicating with any of her year 7 friendships. And this parent talked about how the year 6 friendships had been disrupted. And so this child really felt that when we interviewed her, she hadn't really formed those friendships yet. And this is a key topic in the literature that is protective, and I think also brings up, related to Jindal Snape's multidimensional or multiple transitions theory, how these students are not just going through the transition of primary to secondary, they're also going through the transitions in and out of lockdown twice, and how disruptive those multiple transitions are, but also their families are. And this quote by the year 7 student, that they would have liked to have prepared sufficiently for year 7, but just everyone was just too busy at that time. And busyness itself wasn't necessarily a prevention of that support. Time and time again, students were talking in the qualitative data and the questionnaires about how important and helpful their parents were in that emotional support. And we found that, you know, there were parents working full time who still were able to juggle all those things. But where we're aware that sometimes that wasn't the case, obviously that's an issue that needs to be thought about going forward, but teachers really are as well. And I think we'll come back to that a little bit later, thinking about how the teachers in our study really worked on creating those relationships, and how certain structures in some schools really were able to achieve that. But we've talked very much about some of the difficulties and some of the issues with the learning, but sometimes research can take you a little bit by surprise, can't it, Sandy?
Yeah, so we produced a report and sent this out, and suddenly the research went viral. And the thing that went viral about it was something that we hadn't really been paying enough attention to. So we've been interested in issues surrounding fragmented learning, and how how the experiences were so different for different children, and we were getting increasingly uncomfortable with the catch-up rhetoric in the same way that Gemma's team had been doing, I think. But the thing that the media picked up on was the COVID bubbles. And so suddenly we had a very busy couple of weeks with all sorts of organisations wanting to hear about the research. And they'd sort of seen this phenomenon, really, about the fact that when they were in the COVID bubbles, had a slightly separate Year 7 experience, the children were reporting that they were happier on a number of levels. But the most important one was that I think inadvertently, because of the high stakes system that's built in intensity over the last few decades, we'd forgotten quite how young Year 7 children are, and we were often putting them together with much older children in secondary school and just expecting them to get on with it. And to give them full credit, often they do, but all sorts of things were being noticed by the teachers that people hadn't been aware of for a very long time. So, for example, they were putting Year 7 children in separate little zones in their school. So it wasn't a sort of apartheid. They weren't totally separated off all the time, but they had their own toilets and play area, and they would be in their classrooms and the teachers would come to them a lot of the time. And the teachers noticed that at playtime, and note the word playtime, they were playing as if they were in primary school, and that the relationship building when they were allowed to do that seemed better. And that children were being more autonomous in their work and calmer in school and less anxious about things like getting lost and homework and so on, because it just felt more cozy. And we thought, there's a take-home message here about simple things that you can do in secondary school that don't actually cost anything, that just respect the stage of child development rather better. And we've also been able to compare that to other experiences. People started writing in, teachers and so on, and saying that they were going to experiment with this as well and see how that worked. And some already had. And we also heard from people who, for example, had started new schools where they just take in Year 7 and then the next year they'll take in Year 7 and 8. And children were playing till the end of Year 8. In similar ways that they do in primary school, and then it tails off. And so we had this thing where, they weren't looking at the older children trying to be older than they were. There were also fewer behavioural problems because many teachers said this. They weren't learning the naughty stuff from the older kids as well. And, it was just a lot more manageable, really, and a lot more pleasant. So it will be interesting to see over time how many schools try to experiment with that and see if it works for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Katja.
And so linking that back really to this idea of recovery or catch up, it was really interesting in the very last interviews that we did kind of July, August, some of these Year 7 teachers were actually saying, nope, my Year 7s have caught up. Now, this wasn't across every subject. They could only speak to the subjects they were in. I think science and humanities, the teachers that I spoke to in English. And, so I was like, what, every child? And yeah, pretty much every child and every kind of background. It was interesting thinking about, okay, well, these are if we treat these as mini case studies, looking at those, and one was a Year 6 teacher. And so she spoke about how she was able to reorganize the timetable. She realized the writing was not where it should be and was able to spend more time writing. And then another teacher was in a model school where she has students for 4 subjects. So the Year 7 team are all ex-primary school teachers and teach across the humanities and English, I think. So they see each student every day for at least an hour. And she very much talked about, and this is the teacher who said this quote here, that actually she was able to keep a really good relationship with those students during the lockdowns, and therefore they attacked their learning when they got back and they were just able to catch up. And so there is this idea that kind of smaller Year 7 environment, a bit more like primary, may also be helping with this kind of process of mitigating some of the issues that have come up during this last year, and also it enabled that teacher to kind of prioritize that well-being and relationships. But of course that isn't the case in every school by any means, and for all students, and some students have very complex needs, but it really struck us that was the case for these teachers. But also there are some questions about the curriculum being reprioritized. So the one teacher spoke very much about how, okay, you know, there are definite gaps and things like sex and relationships education, maths random gaps, and in their own subject, I think this teacher was a humanities teacher, what is the powerful knowledge that they need was something she brought up, you know, that thinking about year 8 and this whole process of online and then periods in school, she had really looked at what are the issues, the things that really can't be missed and need to be taught in school, and which ones can maybe be done online a bit more. And so actually going forward, this is maybe a prompt to really think about those secondary school subjects and thinking about how the curriculum could be reprioritized. But then also finally, thinking about this Daisy, this student with global delay, and her parents, and how passionate one of her dads was about the skills that she had developed during lockdown, and how those weren't being accredited, that, you know, she'd had desperately an 18 months really without much support, they felt, and year 8 they really hoped is going to be a better year for her in terms of academically, but actually those life learning skills, and how do we move forward and build on actually the things that not just her but all students have gained in terms of their autonomy, and hopefully, you know, more use of online learning by schools may do that, but it's still a question to keep in our mind that we don't lose, I think, some of what has been gained as well. And that's the end of our presentation. Over to Sinead.
Right. Thank you. And you can see my screen. Perfect. So what I'm going to share with you is a literature review that I conducted with Gemma on the first project that Gemma and Alice mentioned. So one of the tasks as part of that funded research was to do a literature review looking at the idea of learning loss. So I'm going to just take you on a little bit of a background to start with. We know that around 1.5 billion children have been impacted by the closure of schools and universities. And we know that students have been affected by partial reopenings, change of mode of learning, and temporary spells of quarantine. So while schools closed, they were also open, and things were happening that were quite fluid. One of the things that we definitely can agree on is that the long-term effects are unknown, and that there's preliminary evidence that academic achievement has been impacted, but we know that early estimates are tending to overestimate the loss. So if you measure too early, you're tending to get an overestimation. One of the things that's prevalent in the media and policy discussions about what has happened to children during the COVID-19 closures and partial reopenings is this idea of learning loss. And that's where Gemma and myself started looking at learning loss literature to see if we could review that. So to give you a bit of background, that research is primarily US. There's nothing, not that there's anything wrong with that, but you have to acknowledge the difference in, I suppose, educational structure there. So as somebody who's lived and worked in the US, you'll know that, for example, some states, Florida, they went back to school early August. Schools in New York only went back probably last week. And so there's differences in time in terms of how long children are out of school. So when you're looking at a study that examines learning loss, there's differences there. What those studies are looking at is time in school versus time out of school, basically. And does the length of summer holidays matter? And how they measure learning loss is they look at variation in test scores either side of the holidays. So generally a spring fall measurement and looking at the variation between different populations. So we began to look at that literature and then started to dabble and look at learning disruption literature, which is a different literature. So that's worldwide, and it's looking at sudden forced closures due to weather or health related events. They tend to look beyond the academic, look at social, emotional and physical well-being. And the questions that are generally asked is, how does education operate during and after these events? So we started off thinking, let's look at learning loss literature, but then we began to, as we began to map literature, see that there's these two contrasting literatures. So what's wrong or what's right about learning loss literature, and should we be leaning on it as researchers to think about how children are, or to predict how children are going to fare? Well, there are 5 major reviews of learning loss literature out there, and the literature is generally quite contested. So if you're interested in looking at it, there's a very interesting academic debate by a researcher called von Hippel, who's the title of his paper is Learning Loss Real? And there's a back and forth. The one thing that we know about learning loss is that the likely effects are actually quite small. So 1/10 of a standard deviation, children lose a month, these really small measurements. And we have to be very careful as researchers about how we interpret estimates of learning loss. So, for example, someone might say a child loses 2 months of learning. That is a small effect size. We wouldn't pay attention to it in another setting, should we be generally. The other issue is the measurement errors. So children are being tested in spring and fall, for example. They're different tests. They're normed on different populations, and there can be measurement errors. And there's a bigger question as well, and that's to do with learning. And that is the idea of, is learning lost or is it just rusty? So if you have already learned to do something like reading, do you lose it, or does it just become rusty because you don't practice as much? Is learning linear? So we learn something and we incrementally learn more and more and more, or does it travel in waves? And if you look at, if you measure something twice, it'll tend to look like you've lost it, perhaps. But if you would measure more often, and I'm not advocating testing children more often, but you will see that actually children lose and gain as the year goes on. If you look at the research of Megan Kuhfeld, for example, in the States, they have found that, children learn on a faster trajectory in autumn, and then it tends to slow down in the summer. And as a former teacher, that probably makes sense to me. So you have this kind of accelerated learning during the first term, and then as we get to the summer term, there's a gradual wind down. So suffice to say that we began to think that the learning loss literature wasn't as helpful. So we wanted to look at learning loss literature because we thought that it was more equivalent to what was actually happening, and we wanted to see how it could help us to think about this. So the purpose of our rapid evidence review was to assess the utility of learning loss literature. And as you can see, we decided it really wasn't that useful to us. So instead, we decided to look at the other literature, and we wanted to see what were the key issues and recommendations that follow for schools as they reopened following unplanned or extended closures previously. So when we think about an unplanned closure, we use Seeger's definition. So it had to be a specific non-routine event, series of events that creates high levels of uncertainty, threaten or perceived to threaten life and property or general well-being. And we felt that that really fitted with what was happening in the current circumstances, as opposed to the learning loss literature, which was about school holidays, normal school closing, gentle wind down to the end of the year, everybody gets a break, and then we come back refreshed. So we decided that this was more suitable. So what we did was we had a meta-narrative review drawing on Tricia Greenhouse's work. We searched, we mapped, we appraised, we synthesized, and we ended with recommendations. Our inclusion criteria was that the articles were peer reviewed. It was a rapid evidence review, so we had to move quite quickly. And we looked at unplanned closures and subsequent reopening if it was natural disasters, pandemics, or crisis events. And we didn't look at war or, for example, school shootings. We didn't think they were as equivalent. We used the normal databases. And when we were looking at mapping these studies, we looked at design, we looked at comments, we looked at recommendations related to achievement, social and emotional needs, technology, because we felt that was really important in the current circumstances. We looked at the idea of contingency and key quotes. Overall, we screened 307 article abstracts, and we ended up with 15 articles in total. So in terms of our appraisal, we didn't exclude on design because the majority of studies were qualitative, which was actually really helpful because we were wanting to focus on these descriptions and clear descriptions of what schools experienced and what schools recommended. So we looked at, did the researchers give a clear account of the research process? We still wanted good quality studies. Did they have enough data to support the conclusion, and were the claims warranted given the method? Overall, in the 15 studies, they came from a variety of places. Carol Much has written quite a lot about New Zealand and how schools operated post the earthquakes in Christchurch. We also had a lovely collaborative study that was between two researchers, one in Japan following earthquakes and one in New Zealand. We looked at Hurricane Katrina, that we had some studies for that. Another was a flu outbreak, I think it was in Chicago, if I'm right. The Hurricane Katrina studies were interesting in a way. Some of them were based around the politics of schools that, say, closed in New Orleans and didn't reopen, and the displacement of children weren't quite similar. And we looked at key recommendations. So what were researchers saying and what were schools saying to reflect on their experiences. So we coded and we grouped into three key themes in our findings, and we came up with key recommendations at the end. I'm just going to take you through the findings, and as I listened to my colleagues in their presentations, there's so many of the things that have been said by teachers and by parents and by school leaders resonate with our findings here, and kind of are mutually supportive of each other. So we group them under three themes. It's very helpfully into all begin with the C: community, curriculum and care. So let me talk you through them. In terms of community, what schools reflected on and said about their experiences was that local knowledge really, really mattered, that they found it incredibly hard when they had policies that were blanket imposed by departments of education, for example, on how they should reopen, how they should provide education to children, that actually school principals and head teachers knew the dynamics of a school best and were best placed to provide contingent education for children. They knew the dynamics of the families that needed the most support. They knew the dynamics of the community. They knew what supports were available within the community as well, and that they were best placed to support the children in their school. And it became very hard if they received frequent policy directives coming down, no matter whether the intention was good and was trying to be helpful. It was very hard. In the studies that we found, and I think it was 11 studies, there was this notion that head teachers and principals would have really appreciated the time to develop contingency plans based on reflection of what happened. So this was this idea that when the event happened, for example, an earthquake, which obviously hits quite, quicker and harder than COVID did, although one could argue about that, that they would have liked the time to think about, okay, if this happens again, what are we going to do? What are our chains of communication? How do we get information out to parents, for example? How do we communicate with parents? And I think that's happened somewhat organically in the current circumstances. But schools said they really would have liked the time to just draw a breath and think about, what was hard about that, what was easy. And then that idea that leaders and school leaders, they knew their schools best, that leadership was really, really important. And that's linked to the third finding, and I'll come back to it. The other thing that was interesting was the idea of curriculum. So there was only one paper in the 15 that we chose that, or that we selected, that mentioned academic achievement. Rather, what researchers found was that school leaders felt that children, when they came back to school, they needed to learn about the event. They needed not to over discuss it, but to have that time to think about what happened and what was it, and to address misinformation, which is quite interesting. So, you know, that children were picking up bits of news from different sources, but could we educate children about the event so that they didn't have unnecessary anxiety about what happened? That a change in pace and content was really important. So that idea that, you know, you have to slow down a little bit, you have to give children the freedom to get back into school, to get back into their routines. And what was mentioned more so than other curricular areas was that idea of writing and art and creative arts being a good place for self-expression, for processing their feelings about what has happened, about the ideas of grief or loss. And some children didn't want to talk about it. What was interesting about particularly the study, I think it was in Christchurch and Japan, was that children, when they came back to school, they just wanted to play and just be with their friends. But as the months went by, there bubbled up to the surface that need to talk about what had happened to them. And then the third finding was about care, that what happened when you look at learning disruption as opposed to learning loss. In learning disruptions, the entire community is affected. So teachers, TAs, all the members of the ancillary staff, leaders themselves, and children and parents, that they're all affected by what happened. And that's completely different to learning loss literature, where everybody had a holiday and that everybody was affected. So that leaders had this role in caring for not only the children, but also their staff. And particularly if you looked at the literature in terms of Hurricane Katrina, there was this idea that teachers would have really liked the opportunity to have some training in mental health support. And then I think that really ties back to that idea that if we think that schools know their children best, and this idea of local knowledge, so Alice mentioned about national tutoring program that teachers tended to use their own, that actually this fits with it, and that their well-being needs of the community were really, really important. That we just had to slow down and take stock. And again, that school leaders were so vital and so important in terms of that. So what can we conclude from it? We know that predictions of learning loss are uncertain. We think that learning disruption literature is much more useful for decision making. In terms of policy, it kind of pushes us to think, where might funding be used if we're thinking about going forward, and how should it be spent? And when we think about schools, should we be changing the discussion to how to best support the entire school community? Of course, children are vital, but actually thinking of school as a community. So in terms of recommendations, we've concluded with 6 key recommendations. One, given the vital role local knowledge has, that we suggest school leaderships need autonomy to use funds as they see fit. They need to be able to develop contingency plans, and contingency, if you look at the learning disruption literature, accounts for communication systems, chains of information, and the needs of the community. Also, the mental health of children and school personnel is a central concern post unplanned event. We advise providing school leadership with the resources to support their own, of course. There's a lot of stress on school leaders, employees, and children's mental health. That when you return to normal, that you have to acknowledge that children need more time and flexible opportunities to learn. Provide learning materials that educate children about facts about COVID-19, but also opportunity to reflect on what's happened. And we also think going forward, I think this builds on what Gemma had said, is that, perhaps we need to conduct research that also moves beyond calculating learning loss, and that documents the reflections of the school community on the experience of educating during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think dovetails with what my colleagues have discussed in their presentations. I'm just throwing the reference up here that the learning, this review that we conducted is accepted for publication in Educational Review, and we're just waiting on somebody to hit a button and publish it. Or the references are there in Beyond Tiny Writing. So that is me. I think we're going to move to questions and answers now. And I think we're all coming on screen. Yes. Yes. So I'm going to...
Thank you, Sinead.
Yeah. Kachi, you, while I draw a breath, do you have any questions you wanted to start off with?
I just noticed when you were sharing the literature review, there was quite a lot of clapping when you were talking about the community thread in particular, and just thinking as well about what Gemma said about in their study and this idea of not too many policy directives and the lack of interference that you spoke about. How do you think schools could be best supported to kind of determine their own path forward? Like what from your kind of findings from the literature review and with schools, the case study schools, what do they need, rather than just being told this is the catch-up funding, and this is it kind of thing?
If I come in on that one, I do think that COVID has created a real challenge to how we organise education in England. Although notionally speaking, school head teachers have autonomy, and that means levels of stress were very high during the pandemic. There are independent sources of information on that for teachers because they were carrying enormous responsibilities and having to adjust very quick. I think all of us in our different studies have drawn attention to the way in which teachers have been grappling with difficult problems and in a way experimenting and then adjusting what they're doing because of the nature of the feedback. What is missing in the English system at the moment is very strong local spaces where we could get some collective discussion going. That's one reason we looked in our second study at the role of brokers. And what we see is that things are very patchy. Some schools are very well supported by local authorities. Some schools may be in a mat where the organisation is distant and doesn't know the local context. We're missing locally based forums, which would also have the capacity to bring into the picture services to support mental health and public health. There is, the fact that we no longer have a middle tier does matter. Given that's an absence, what can schools do? I think encouraging schools to share in whatever forums they do have access to, talk over their experience would be really helpful. And I do think there is an obligation for researchers to carry on looking at what schools themselves have been doing and learning.
Yeah, thank you. Sandy?
It also occurred to me that we have an occupational category missing, really, given the heterogeneity of the UK school population. We don't have social pedagogy, and this is something that's quite common in Scandinavia and Germany and so on. So that sort of bridging between the educational and the social was what head teachers had to do 19-hour days trying to do. And I can think of no better thing really to come out of the pandemic than this to flourish really as a new career path for people, actually, a sort of specialist route, perhaps alongside new training routes for special educational needs coordinators as well. And this might be specialist routes that teachers might choose after some years in the profession and so on. And I think a lot of good could be done then in sort of having that dialogue and bringing people together, but also having some kind of evidence-informed professional practice doing this, rather than people having to hit the phones and find out where they're going to get their packed lunches from and that kind of thing. At times like this, it's too late, really. You don't want to be reinventing the wheel. You need your resilience plan, your disaster plan in place early on, with professional people to support it, rather than just have to ad lib, I think.
I was wondering if Sinead was going to come in and say something from the literature review about the importance of finding time to develop that contingency plan for next time round. I think it is worth absolutely emphasising, as both Katya's presentation and our research, maybe not our presentation, did, that things really did change over the period of closure. So that by the time schools got to doing remote learning in January, they were much better equipped. And they were much better equipped not just because the equipment was out there and more families had access, but also they had experimented and found that, for instance, giving children a space with the cameras switched off where the teacher isn't there teaching on a Zoom call so that they can chat amongst themselves was really valuable. So it's the unexpected. It's like the protective effect bubbles, which we've also got on our research database, actually. Okay, to be able to sort of draw that together and develop a contingency plan next time round, these are the things that we've learned that we know will really matter. That would be really helpful if there was official encouragement to do that.
And I think in the literature anyway was this idea that effective development of contingency needs to be supported as well. But it's a vital part of it. And there was I can't remember the author of the study, but one of the things that came through, especially in New Zealand literature, was this idea of researchers and school communities actually having the opportunity to translate together what it meant. So, for example, working on researchers supporting schools to reflect and then presenting it back to schools and dialoguing with that. So I see kind of blue sky thinking a space for more dialogue in that sense, but definitely a chance to draw a breath. That was the overriding thing from the literature, was that actually just opening the doors and starting back and jumping onto we need to make up for the lost learning is not helpful to anyone. Alice?
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of our experiences of doing these research projects is how keen people are to talk about their experiences. And the head teachers actually in the interviews, particularly when we said, can you go back and talk us through it from the beginning, they were really pleased to talk it through and reflect on the process and to talk about how much had changed and how that they responded and how they felt they were doing it much better than they were at the start. And even that research process itself seemed to help. And that certainly supports that point from the literature, that actually having time to share with, particularly maybe with other head teachers or other people who've been through the same process, would be a really meaningful thing to do and very helpful actually in thinking ahead. And we hopefully won't have to deal with this again, but thinking ahead about how schools can cope and they can use that local knowledge and all that information that they've gained to actually provide better the next time around.
Absolutely. We have a question that I'm going to pose, and it says, do you think that the pandemic would force more homeschool collaboration to carry on the momentum of building on children's autonomy and motivation?
I can field that one. I did notice there was a session by the Alternative Schooling SIG hoping that this might be an outcome. I think we are aware from our research data that there has been a real investment in communicating with parents in a way that maybe schools didn't have to think quite so much on a day-to-day basis about how to get parents informed and engaged. And engaged is probably more important than informed, because your classic school communication is a letter that goes home in a book bag. Whereas actually where schools learnt most about sustaining autonomous learning on the part of children was when they went with feedback from parents. Now, it's also true on our database. We are aware that because we spoke to parents, There are some parents who wanted more routine. They wanted to be bossed about by the school, and they wanted more busy work because they've got things they wanted to get on with. There were other parents who wanted the flexibility to adjust their routines, who realised that you could not persuade a 7-year-old to sit at a table as if they were in a classroom over the time of the day, that actually you had to re-establish a different kind of routine at home, where you break up the day by going for a walk or doing something different. So there was a real diversity amongst parents talking about their experience. I remember distinctly one parent who felt that the school really was not doing enough for her dyslexic son, that she had no real contact with the teaching assistant, as a result of which she herself had spent more time with her dyslexic son, adjusting the tasks so that they were interesting to him rather than focused on, you must do this. And so she found to her own surprise that when he went back into school, his reading was rated as having considerably improved. Now, for her, that was a kind of, what's wrong with teachers? Why aren't they doing what I'm doing? So I think if you open up the box of parent reaction, you get very varied responses. But I do think it needs to be part of the conversation. And we certainly found that the schools that did best handled that homeschool parent engagement really well and invested in it.
I think the notion that there's I guess that it is an issue of Journal for Education for, I think it's students placed at risk, but that's one of the key findings in one of the papers was this idea of children's autonomy, that actually being left to have to manage things a bit more was really, really, really helpful for them, that we may perhaps, and with best intentions, especially for children with special educational needs, hold their hands a bit too much, and that actually there has been these opportunities to manage their own timetables and do those kind of things. Any other response? I have another question, which I think is going to keep us going for a long time. So this is from Sean Hayes. What chance of schools being able to put children's well-being front and centre for the foreseeable, and the government backing off from at least some of the high accountability, high stakes testing that it still seems to be obsessed with?
Well,
I just imagine they can really. I mean, the thing is, it's really interesting because sometimes some of my projects, I work with Germany a lot, and they have a complete secrecy omerta over how schools are doing, and nobody's allowed to know how results compare. And if you're choosing a school, it's all on gossip, and you barely even look around. I mean, it just isn't the information available to parents. So on the one hand, I'm used to, particularly at the IOE, saying, "Oh, high stakes, really bad," and it does come with attendant problems on an immense scale. On the other hand, looking at a system where there isn't any useful information available to parents, and children are triaged in quite an untransparent way as well by teachers before they even go into secondary school. It's really difficult to justify that as well. And I wonder if and this is controversial, I wonder if we've got the lesser of two evils, and Gemma's going to sit on me now. But probably there's going to be a third way, isn't there, Gemma, in the middle, where it's a little bit more sort of child-centric. And also, I think time is important here. Our kids are sort of kept on a timetable for their development that's unnecessary. And we know that there's, 2 to 3 years difference in development terms at adolescence. And lower down, there's things like birth year is important, and the type of birth that you had, up to the age of 8 and so on. We're measuring children with the sort of Bernstein symbolic ruler the whole time, and being worried if they're not hitting these targets at the exact time, and then we give them one chance, and if they don't get it right, all hell breaks loose. So maybe we can just try and find that third way, and a bit of the flexibility that we've been looking for a while, and just say, if we could give them a few goes at things and a little bit of space to do things, maybe they will be getting where we want them to go, but just not in such a rigid, sort of regimented way. Gemma?
I know that Sean Hayes is part of a BERA expert panel on assessment, of which I was the chair, who have published an alternative, which is to take the English system to national sampling as a way forward. It means you could actually use national sampling. And in fact, Germany does this. Okay, maybe they keep it private. Our adaptation was that the test instruments would be available for schools, standardized, but covering way more areas than just the tiny fraction even of the English curriculum that we now pretend to examine. I mean, the SPAG test as a kind of exit score from primary schools isn't sufficient. So there is a need. Some of us are advocating for much bigger reform, but I think the question really rests with teachers. It rests with what this experience has taught them. And one of the things that I think comes across very loud and clear in our data is that the delivery momentum built into our curriculum by a very thin test design. So we test very thin competencies, but we freight them with enormous significance for schools. It has all kinds of distorting effects. Think about what Sinead's review of the learning disruption literature says. We need to relax the curriculum. Think about your understanding of what's been going on with bubbles, with smallering down classes in secondary schools. We all need to think about the consequences of the pandemic in the long term, not as a short-term scramble to make sure that next autumn terms phonics test scores for year 2 are the same as they would have been. This is a ridiculous and inappropriate measure. But I do think the impetus for this rests with the body of the teaching profession, all right? And partly what we've been trying to do back in our research is to say back to the teaching profession, the things that you're unhappy about, you're right to be unhappy about. All right, you cannot run a curriculum, a meaningful curriculum, on a delivery pace set in Whitehall and then measured on very thin test metrics.
I'm just going to add as well, the thing that came out very strongly from some of the interviews we've done. We asked about lessons learned and about, what would your message be to the government? And one that came out from several of our cases was they said, we haven't had tests for 2 years and the world has not fallen apart. And that message that actually, do we need this? I feel like head teachers have been really emboldened actually to question the need for this. I did research on SATs in 2019, which is like the last normal year, and SATs were the biggest thing in primary schools. They were a major, major focus of so much activity and so much worry and concern. And COVID came along, swept all that away and said, actually, now what we care about is feeding children, keeping them safe, and then some learning. And that kind of shift in priority and the fact that head teachers have had to completely change what they're, thinking and caring about so much, I think has emboldened them to be much more vocal in their, views against that. So my view is that this is a moment of which we can build on that kind of experience over the last 2 years and actually say, this is the time to kind of break down the accountability system. I know there is like real limits to what can actually happen if it all just comes back, but I would say that there is a more of an open door to push back against it now than there has ever been before. Certainly in the last 20 years.
I just want to add one other thing, and I also sat in on the session that Sean was involved with Tanya Ovenden Hope. I think one of the things that COVID has shown in abundance is the material poverty impacts on children's learning, independent of what a school does. All right. If schools are actually having to provide breakfast so that children are ready to learn, what else is it in the child's environment that is inhibiting them having the best opportunity in school? So schools weren't talking, as Amanda Spielman's quote would suggest, about welfare versus learning. What they were saying is you have to address welfare first. This is a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you address children's welfare, then they will be ready to learn. I am intrigued by the fact that there is good economics research from the economics discipline showing a very strong correlation between family income and attainment. Let's think about that for a moment. Okay, part of the problem to equalising and closing gaps is actually ensuring that we have fewer children in the UK growing up in desperate poverty. And some of what schools have learned through COVID is quite what that depth of poverty looks like at home.
Thanks, Gemma. Two other questions I can see coming up. One was how near to normality are schools as they start 21-22?
Well, we don't really have any research, I would say, but as a parent, I'd say my children's school is pretty much back to normal. I think we found a lot of things that schools had learnt, so that certainly things haven't gone exactly back to how they were in, 2019. The schools have found various things that they brought in because of COVID that they were going to keep, the COVID keepers, they called them, things to do with parental communication, to do with things, timetabling, lunch times, various things that they'd never changed for years and years and years. And then they changed them because of COVID and then found that actually they worked a lot better. So there are definitely things that are kind of long-term changes. But in general, my impression is that schools are pretty much back to normal with no bubbles, so on. And schools are not embarking on dramatic catch-up programs, for everybody. They are still kind of doing the normal work of identifying children and putting in extra resources and so on. But they are not kind of changing the curriculum in some dramatic fashion in a sort of panic, as some people might be.
There's very few trips, though, Alice. There's very little in the way of residentials, trips, that sort of visits, that sort of enrichment stuff. Very quiet this year, and I don't blame them, because I don't see how you could usefully do a risk assessment for a theatre trip at the moment.
Our professional colleagues will probably tell us, but certainly my experience is that residential trips are back, normal trips are back, everything is kind of gone back to normal. But again, that's anecdotal, schools I know rather than anything else. I think in kind of legal terms, pretty much everything is back to normal in terms of government advice. I know secondaries are dealing with the testing regime, and then they'll have to deal with vaccination, which is all a bit unknown. But I think the kind of research-informed answer is that things are relatively back to normal.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, so this question is, to what extent do you think inspection and/or policy may impact how schools plan for recovery longer term? Do they have anything to contribute?
Can you say that again? I didn't quite get that.
To what extent do you think inspection and/or policy may impact how schools plan for recovery longer term? Do they have anything to contribute?
Well, policy and inspection do have something to contribute if they would listen more carefully to what schools have actually been dealing with. I think that's the trouble. It's the disconnect between what policymakers see. The amount of panicking there was over the possibility that tests wouldn't happen, as if this absolutely defined children's experience in schools, was quite extraordinary. And that's because policy making at the DFE relies simply on the test metrics. And we had good evidence right the way through of senior system leaders just tearing their hair out at the kind of conversations that are happening with the DFE. It brings me back to the point about the middle tier. We've got to get a system. There's a lot of talk up there about learning communities. Okay, to be in a learning community, you also have to listen. We need to create circumstances where those most removed from the classroom, including Ofsted, actually listen first to what teachers say. And try and learn from, if we encourage that kind of collective reflection that Sinead highlighted, that then needs to percolate up and be listened to. Okay, so that's one very important point. On the testing, I think what is actually happening in schools is that they're re-owning diagnostics. They are using, schools haven't given up. Schools have been tracking phonics, anecdotally from our case studies. In fact, quite a few of our schools operating in high deprivation contexts thought the phonics was going okay, relatively reasonable, easy to manage online. That was okay. Where there were the real gaps was for particularly EAL children who haven't had enough exposure to spoken English. Okay, so the government has invested in a very well attested, evidence informed programme run by a colleague of mine at IOE to roll out and hoover some of that up. Training for the teachers who will deliver that programme takes the autumn term. The programme won't start until spring, and it's targeted. Actually, what EAL kids in the early years need is immersion in rich speaking and language environments. They don't need targeted support. They need an enriched environment in which to be with their peers. Now, unless you start off link number one, listening to schools' experience, you'll never get there. You won't know that that's what's really needed. And that really is the problem with the system that we've got. In a system where Ofsted and policymakers aren't listening, another reason for getting a bit more collaborative talk between schools is that so they are in a position to say, sorry, that's fine. That's fine, Amanda Spielman. You can complain that we didn't behave like private schools early enough. Actually, we weren't in a position to do what private schools did around remote learning because not every child in every class had their own room and their own PC and heating enough to sit in front of it dressed in their uniform and get on with small class teaching. We're just talking about very different contexts. So it really does behove policymakers and the inspectorate to listen, then talk.
Thanks.
Sorry. It's the effect of actually listening.
Absolutely. I don't think any other comments on that?
We got some data on private school experiences, and it was interesting that they felt they'd had a learning journey as well. So the immediate and we got quite good data on this. The immediate instinct was to lay it all on and have them sitting there all day. And they rapidly became worn out, the kids. And the independent schools needed to take a step back and think, hang on. This isn't just about showing to the parents that we're providing something in return for the fees. We're going to have to really think through the pedagogy of what we're doing here, particularly at primary level. They had to become a lot more flexible and just set activities that the families could do at home. But then some of the parents were obviously heavily involved in the COVID response, doctors and so on. And then they had to think, okay, so what can we do that's going to allow for these children to be supported? So they had to do a lot of learning on their feet as well. So yeah, they had a lot of tech, and everybody had decent buildings to be operating in. But it was more complicated than you'd think. So I think the teaching profession as a whole has taken a huge step forward actually, and learnt some autonomy themselves. Grabbed that again, and had a bit more confidence in their own ability as professional educators to determine what the people that they're trying to teach actually need. And you're talking about diagnostics and so on coming back. I think that's really important, and the ability to write your own curriculum on the hoof if necessary and so on. And these are things that have been de-skilled for the last 20 years or so. And now we're seeing people a lot more confident in and they have the skills to do this, but a lot more confidence bringing them into the everyday. So I think that's one really positive outcome.
I think those are both important points. And Sandy, I'd love you to get that stuff on the private schools adjustments out into the public domain, the same way as you did on the bubbles. I know we are stuck as researchers with what the media will hoover up. And the media consistently through the COVID pandemic have a preference for disaster stories in which we're all going to hell in a handcart and surely there will be no child who's left unscarred. Actually, there are positives that are coming out of this. And to exactly what you're saying, where there is to get the research evidence rather than rely on press reports on what private schools are supposedly doing really makes a difference. So I posed a question about what should research be doing given a politically conflicted arena in which we're in. And I think bringing evidence to bear on some of that does really matter, actually. We do have a role.
Yeah, I mean, they work more closely with the state sector than you'd think as well. I mean, some private schools are acting as hubs for the, not every school open for key workers and so on. So it was done geographically. So sometimes it was a private school that would open as a local hub and provide the support there. And that was never reported on. It was a completely different picture when the teacher's in the middle of it.
Yeah,
I think we've got to wrap up now. We're bang on time. I'm just going to pull together two comments. One was just saying it's been so eye-opening to hear how schools have adapted and how they might adapt. I think that's the interesting thing about logistically 5 of us work from the same building and we're all working on separate projects, but there's common themes. And I think the last comment goes to Rich, who said, super cool team IOE. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. It was a real pleasure. Okay, with that, I think we're finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.